It's basically following the same script that the US has used for the last 100+ years in Latin America. The example that popped into my head was Venezuela, right? Because in 2014, we had in Venezuela some violent street protests that were very similar, eerily similar to what happened in Nicaragua in 2018. I mean, you see pictures of the two protests and you can't tell which country you're in, really, because that's how similar they are. You know, people were dressed, the protesters were all dressed alike. They had shields that looked like they were crusader shields. And one of the big similarities between the people on the streets conducting this violence in Nicaragua, in Venezuela, was that they were funded and trained by the United States. Was that they got the kid glove treatment by the corporate media. A media that portrayed them as freedom fighters, as students, when they weren't either. These were political operatives, and in some cases, these were members of organized crime who were basically paid to go out on the streets and cause chaos, paid to terrorize the civilian population, and in order to create this kind of narrative about chaos in a country, in order to justify U.S. intervention. And in Venezuela, they failed. They tried it in 2014 and they failed. They tried again in 2017 and they failed to overthrow the government, that is. But in 2014, as a direct response to those protests, you had the Venezuela Defense of Human Rights and Civil Society Act, which was, you know, this basically very similar to the RENACER Act, in that it established a framework basically for the sanctions on Venezuela. And the same thing is going to happen if the RENACER Act passes in the House. It's going to establish a framework for sanctions on Nicaragua. They're going to be extremely hard to lift because the White House could lift them whenever they want. But, of course, there's so much pressure from the right wing and from, including some Democratic right-wingers like Bob Menendez, Albiocires, among others. There's going to be so much pressure to maintain these killer sanctions that, you know, we're going to be at a loss as to how to stop them. So for Nicaragua, it's incredibly important that we stop these particular sanctions before they're implemented.